Welcome back to the Hate Meditations podcast. I hope you're well. After the previous episode where we had quite an intense discussion on AI, I figured we'd do something a bit more casual and easygoing today. And well, as far as I'm concerned, going a little bit off the beaten track. And we're just going to discuss US power metal and maybe more broadly the sort of trad metal, heavy metal, oeuvre or whatever you want to call it. Literally in terms of coming at it from being an extreme metal fan. So I'm joined as ever by Joseph April, who is much more well versed in this than me. But yeah, good to have you on, Joseph.
Good to see you, Shelley, and hi everyone. Everyone listening.
Yeah, so basically what we've done is I'm not very like clued up on this phenomenon, but I was listening to some I think it was Eternal Champion that I was actually listening to, and I was like, yeah,
Okay.
it hits all the beats in terms of retro stuff, but it's for them in particular. I found it quite like because it's not quite as bombastic, shall we say, and abrasive as some stuff. I just got really into it, and I was like curious about going back to some of the kind of original material. So yeah, so what I did is I asked Joseph to basically recommend me like a primer of like 5 albums, and then he's also given me about 5 extra albums to follow up on to kind of get into the original phenomenon that was US power metal. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this as well is because as a fan of extreme metal, um, I sort of skipped over classic heavy metal in kind of getting into stuff as a fan who's like an elder millennial as well. I got into metal when extreme metal was already like its own thing. It was well established, sort of the early to mid 2000s. The original kind of, the second wave of black metal, the third wave was kind of getting underway. Death metal would sort of run its course and was going off in all these different directions. So it was already all there for me, and I just skipped over like doing a deeper dive into classic metal. So obviously, like being a getting into the bigger names in that style, Maiden, Priest, Sabbath, and all of that. And then over the years, just because I'm from the UK, I dug a little more into like the new wave of British heavy metal. But again, it was always from the perspective of being into extreme metal. So it'd be like, okay, well, Angel Witch are quite formative to that. Venom, you could argue, would lumped into that as well. Witchfinder General, and then yeah, maybe like incidentally coming across some Saxon and stuff, but always finding it a lot closer to rock and roll. Less to a lesser extent, like a band like Satan, who were a bit more complex, and then something like Raven, which I think the thing about the new wave of British heavy metal that people find confusing is there's no coherent sound that is the new wave of British heavy metal. It was just a bunch of bands that happened to be playing heavy metal to hard rock at around the same time. But also it is a real kind of bridge genre in that it is still like connected to time and place. Like a lot of the lyrics, there is some fantasy in there, but nowhere near to the extent that there is in US power metal. It's still a lot of like, bikers and scrapping on the street, or just, kind of lyrical themes you'd almost find in a lot of blues rock, sort of moaning about your
Yeah.
job or women and so on.
Yeah, very very working class type of lyrics.
mm, yeah, definitely. Um,
No, I mean you were kind of explaining yourself, kind of going back out of, I guess, curiosity, or maybe hitting a point of, looking for something more. So looking into the past and getting into the new wave of British heavy metal and kind of noting the particulars about that. I think you kind of left off talking about how at times it still lingers, especially with bands like Saxon or some others, still lingers into sort of a AC/DC or very 70s hard rock kind of working class ethos, and even in the lyrics in terms of like you and your buddies going to the pub and getting into a fight with, a different group and then running home.
yeah, definitely. And as far as like my knowledge is concerned, it seemed to jump from that to what you would call like, I mean, I think people refer to it as like Euro metal or Euro power metal, but that's more like the speed metal side of things, where you've got the
Yeah.
German stuff of slightly
Well,
later on, like Blind Guardian and Halloween and things.
yeah.
Uh,
It's interesting because, you know, as we mentioned, we're going to discuss U.S. power metal. Um, and it's funny because most people, when they hear power metal, they think of the pretty bigger names in Europe, or the ones that have kind of, even these days, like in the last 10, 15 years, have kind of broken into very kind of poppy type of metal. But US power metal has some very distinct differences, and certainly never got quite as big as what would be considered probably the biggest names in European power metal, save a handful of bands that went into different genre directions, like progressive metal and just traditional metal in general.
yeah, I'm guessing
But
like
those are really a handful.
Queensrÿche
Yeah.
is the
Well,
example you're thinking of there, and
Queensrÿche and Fate's Warning, who I think are really kind of a predecessor to something like Dream Theater.
yeah.
Um, and then
Um,
Manowar kind of breaking out from US power metal just to be Manowar. Um,
um, yeah, they're their own institution in a lot of ways. But yeah, just on that as well, going back to when I was getting into metal, I think the first time I came across the term power metal was actually because Dragon Force were getting absolutely huge, and they were
mhm.
obviously like a pastiche band in a lot of ways. Um, I don't want to say a joke band because that might be a little bit harsh, but they were definitely in the same way that people perceive bands like Ghost and now Castle Rat as well, in that they're a bit almost playing up to the fact that they're just playing into certain aesthetics and hitting certain beats, to
I think
leaning
they
into
were,
that. But
yeah, I think they were one of the first European power metal bands that kind of had a bit of a meta self awareness,
exactly,
and
yeah.
kind of showed it. Um, Whereas you wouldn't say that about something like Halloween, Gamma Ray, or even Stradivarius or something like that.
No,
Um,
or yeah,
and
Hammerfall.
and that, yeah,
I think there's something
yeah.
about the German and Swedish sensibility where they don't really have irony. Well, they do, obviously they do, but in that
Gee,
kind
go
of
go
music, they're
figure.
very like there's no duality of
Yeah,
meaning. It is what it is.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think people, listeners here, we're going to be a little free floating with this, but since you're new to this, I think we should kind of lead this with me sort of asking questions and kind of almost interviewing you on your quick little journey into this scene. But so
Yeah.
I guess my first question would be what was your perception of US power metal before you did this little deep dive, and then what seems to be now your at least immediate impression after having done that?
Um, so I was familiar with some of the bands we're going to discuss, obviously Manowar and Queensrÿche because they exploded out of
Hmm.
that scene. I was also familiar with something like Cirith Ungol, although I know they're not like typical of the style.
Yeah.
Um, for the other bands, yeah, of course I've heard of things like Fate's Warning. I'd heard of Crimson Glory, but it's mostly just stuff that I kind of absorb through osmosis. But in terms of the actual sound, I figured it was kind of just a development on literally the new wave of British heavy metal, maybe with a slightly more fantastical kind of what's the word, fantastical element to it in terms of the lyrical
Hmm.
themes, maybe a bit of sci-fi in there as well. And we jokingly said when we were discussing this episode, yeah, I literally imagined it to be like a brighter, more polished version of that run of like heavy metal from the UK from
Hmm.
1978 to about 83 or 84. Um, and then having listened to a good chunk of albums over the last 4 days, I would say at least 10 or 11, probably more. Um, I am getting more of a sense of the fact that it co-evolved with genres that I'm much more familiar with, namely thrash and then very
Yep.
early black metal and early death metal as well. In that, um, you know, these bands were kind of they knew about Metallica, they knew about Slayer, and Slayer and stuff knew about them, and they were kind of trading, swapping ideas. And as you know, most listeners will know, the genre tags weren't as well defined back then. People were kind of just throwing around words to kind of frame what this music is, but a lot of different ideas were floating around, and it wasn't as codified as it is now. So what I found interesting was just almost like this might sound a little bit over the top, but it's like discovering a parallel civilization that has evolved
Yep.
along very similar lines, but there are slight differences and stuff. And just for the listeners' sake, like you've recommended me albums from about 1983 all the way up to 89, and you can definitely feel that evolution as thrash exploded. The US power metal evolves into something that would be recognizably power metal to the modern ear, and that is not the case for the earlier stuff. It is much more like traditional heavy metal. There's still massive elements of Black Sabbath in there,
Hmm.
but but it is kind of evolving towards that, and it's just interesting to see that happening at the same time as bands like Slayer were getting more extreme, and they would pass the torch to bands like Death and so on. Ditto for bands
Hmm.
like Bathory, and as black metal was kind of coming up around the mid 80s and so on. It's just interesting to see the cross pollination, I suppose you'd call it.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's in a lot of ways, it's, US power metal existed, its height was certainly in the 80s, and you can tell it came out of the new wave of British heavy metal. Like the new wave had a big part to it because US power metal really didn't get its start till just about the same time as thrash, like 82, 83, with like the earliest EPs and albums. And then it did really kind of peter out at the end of the 80s into the beginning of the 90s. And in some ways, I didn't give you really, mostly because I wanted it as an introduction, so I mostly gave you 80s bands, but the genre has continued, but it definitely went underground during that kind of the same time as hair metal and glam metal kind of disappeared. Like traditional, like if you weren't thrash at least or death metal, like you weren't really going to survive the 90s. And it wasn't until the late 90s that some bands really started sticking out and kind of going back to the more traditional sounds. The big one to mention with that would be Lord, Weird, Slow Fag, and a few other bands like that. Um, and ever since then, it's kind of morphed and shifted. I will say a number of times here, I'll probably make reference to observations that very good websites together some guides on not only US power metal, but a few other kind of micro genres, especially that lean in the traditional. So I want to give credit to Ride into Glory and its chief editor, Marco, who did a number of guides on this. And I think his observations were very accurate. So with your impression, what what do you think sonically kind of separates US power metal from either European power metal or from even things that were happening with the new wave of British heavy metal and even, some of the later bands like Satan?
Yeah, so I did read the Ride into Glory article, and I'll link it into the in the description as well because it is a really interesting primer for a lot of this. So I might be repeating some things I heard there, but that is not
Mhm.
consciously so. I'm going to try and come at it with my own angle. But sonically, there's the obvious stuff which the Ride into Glory article makes reference to that we've already discussed. Is I've mentioned that the more, I want to say, esoteric lyrical themes, drawing
Mhm.
much more heavily on fantasy. Let's not forget that this was also a time when there was an explosion of like sword and sorcery films. Tabletop gaming was D&D was getting really big. Fantasy literature was exploding as well, and it's sort of to again contrast it with New Album. It's losing that realism that was kind of a holdover of the 70s, is still being connected to the reality that the musicians were living in. So there's definitely that element. Musically, it's obvious that they are also shedding the blues elements to a greater extent than the British bands were. But I think that
Mhm.
also is specifically why I mentioned the connections with early thrash as well, because it is interesting seeing this group of bands do it in a way that isn't quite so connected to punk. So a lot of it is still like
Yeah.
really quite extreme. Well, not extreme for to modern ears, but extreme for the time. I was surprised at how, for instance, like Metal Church's self-titled debut, the first few tracks could easily have been written by Slayer. Like it's that heavy and
Yeah.
fast and thrashing, but it does kind of peter out a little bit with, I think there's a ballad in there, but it's still like quite an extreme album. Ditto something like Omen as well. So definitely like kind of heavier and less bluesy than new wave of British heavy metal, but also in a lot of ways just way more eccentric, I think. And it's because it's quite
Hmm.
early on still in the evolution of metal in general. The European bands are much more polished. They're much more operatic. I think they put a lot more emphasis on virtuosity, in particular in the vocal department as well. And maybe they were drawing on more, neoclassical and classical music, whereas the US power metal bands, they kind of bridge that gap of they're still very DIY, still very rough, but they are doing something much more like ambitious and kind of cinematic than say Saxon or Raven or yeah those British bands that I mentioned. So yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
a like I said, yeah, it's that weird sort of parallel universe that's evolving alongside early thrash and early death metal and so on.
I think there, yeah, you commented on a few differences there. Some things I would add on the sonic level. It's kind of a thicker sound, which I think is attributed to the bass still being very upfront. Also, the vocals, like you kind of mentioned, the virtuosic kind of character, and there's still a bit of a grit. Like I feel like a lot of, at least until you get to the more progressive leaning bands, I think a lot of the US power metal bands still kind of looked up to kind of a Paul Diano kind of type of vocal delivery. Um, I mean, certainly there's some vocalists trying to do their best Dickinson and Halford as well, but there is still a bit of a street grit to it. It does not feel like, as much as it's fantastical, it doesn't have just kind of like the operatic kind of character to it quite as much.
Well, yeah, an
Um
album like sorry to cut in, but an album like the
mhm.
Omen Battle Cry,
Yeah.
it almost they sing about the same stuff as like a very traditional heavy metal band, like drinking and women and so on, but they just replace it with like fantasy lyrics, like the song "Be My Wench" or whatever it's called, instead of like going out and fighting in gangs. They're replacing all of that with axes and armies and stuff. It feels very much like the same like ethos, just with a few
Yeah.
of the the vocabulary changed around to fit like a fantasy or medieval scenario. But yeah,
And I think it's sort of a blending of the more, I think, the fantastical. Like in some ways, I think U.S. Power Metal is very much a blending together of Dio's career in a lot of ways, which I think you can kind of point to him as for both U.S. and Euro Power Metal, where a lot of all this stuff comes from. You look at Rainbow during his tenure there. You look at his tenure in Black Sabbath, which I think I've heard Manowar mention that was a major influence on them, and it's kind of easy to see it being an influence on a lot of bands. And then even up through 83, 84 with the first couple of solo Dio albums, I think, like, if you're looking at this, historically, like, where does all this come from? I would say the Dio side is definitely where, but at the same time as well, Priest, I think, is very much there. And the way to conceptualize a lot of the US power metal, I think, is sort of like you take the Dio kind of slay the dragon kind of energy, but at the same time, you're a band that's riding your motorcycles to the gig. And you can see this in Manowar. You can see this in a number of other bands. You can certainly see it in Armored Saint. I think literally the music video has them like dressed up in armor riding motorcycles. Like that just puts it right there. Um, And at the same time, the interesting thing about US Power Metal was it really was living tangentially with like the burgeoning thrash scene in the US. And you can just see it in terms of how these bands were clearly playing gigs with a lot of the early thrash scene. I mean, Armored Saint, obviously, John Bush went on to join Anthrax. Even before that, he supposedly was discussed quite closely to become Metallica's vocalist when James wasn't feeling confident to take up that on. So you can see that there's a very close relationship, but at the same time, I feel like the US power metal scene were bands that never wanted to fully embrace the hardcore punk influences that the thrash bands did, which made thrash metal really what it was, which was like, you know, you have new wave of British heavy metal, which is like taking the first wave of punk influencing into everything that happened in the 70s, and then boom, there you have new wave of British heavy metal. And then the thrash band sort of took that and then mixed it with the hardcore punk, whether it was the US, especially stuff like Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys, and then as well the British influence of stuff like GBH and Discharge. Um, and the US power metal scene still wanted to be heavy and aggressive, and certainly I think wanted to take what they heard in new wave British heavy metal or stuff like Dio's works and Priest, and just really go even harder and faster. But the hardcore punk isn't there, and that's what really separates it from the full-on thrash, at least until, you know, I some of the albums I mentioned, and there's some others I didn't, but there are some bands that pretty much go into full thrash.
Mm. It's interesting because as well as not absorbing the hardcore punk element, they don't lean into like satanic or gory themes so much.
Yeah,
It is all
I
done
mean
through the
that.
lens of fantasy to some extent.
Yeah, that then, and I think that's a big difference is that you look at the U.S. thrash metal bands. I mean, the one thing is you listen to like even with the satanic aspects of like Slayer Show No Mercy, but like you take that or you take Metallica's Kill 'Em All. I think those albums in particular fit very well and comfortably with a lot of the U.S. power metal. In the same way as well, especially giving Merciful Fates more progressive leanings, like fit very well with early Fates Warning and even early Queensrÿche. I know many people often talk about how two of the best albums of '84 were Don't Break the Oath and then Queensryche's The Warning. And The Warning is very much Queensrÿche at its peak US power metal moment.
Yes. Um, should we dive into some of these individual releases then? I've ordered them chronologically, but we can jump
Yeah.
around a little bit. We don't have to do them all, but like,
Yeah, yeah. The only other generality I'd mention is that for the listeners, I think a good way of conceptualizing, you know, I already mentioned like the biker meets fantasy thing, and I think you can certainly see that in something like Omen or certainly uh, you know, a few other bands, Jag Panzer. But another thing I think is like the European power metal. I think you can look to a lot of like the 90s and well 80s into 90s, a lot of like the fantasy writers, and you can kind of feel a relationship there with them. US power metal, and especially as we get into it with bands like Manilla Road and Cirith Ungol, but I think in general have like a pulp fiction feel to it. Like when you look at the pulp writers, and certainly, you know, like Conan the Barbarian, obviously with Howard, but then you know the Lovecraft and all this other stuff. There's a very pulpy paperback feel, I think, to U.S. power metal, as opposed to maybe more high fantasy type of fiction.
yeah, I know what you're getting at there. It's because yeah, fantasy fiction is its own universe of different styles and genres. And yeah, US power metal are definitely leaning into, as you say, the pulp side of it. It's barbarians and stuff instead of elves and wizards quite so much. And yeah, like I said, that's almost the way for them to transplant the realism that heavy metal at that time was still kind of wedded to into a slightly more fantastical setting, but not going full kind of symphonic opera in the way that some of the European bands started going to by the 90s as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, just going back. So I've highlighted some of the albums that really stood out. So going back to like the very
Mhm.
earliest, we're roughly kind of saying this movement. It literally started almost like as soon as new wave of British heavy metal kind of had run out of steam as a movement. Obviously, the bigger
Mhm.
acts from that scene kept going and became much like the Manowars and Queensrÿches of America. They became their own institutions. Judas Priest were already an institution by the 80s anyway. They'd been going for years, but Iron Maiden became their own juggernaut. Saxon to a lesser extent, but yeah. But by the time bands like Angel Witch and Witchfinder General and stuff sort of run out of steam, you've got bands like Warlord, who I can't remember.
Mhm.
I haven't put if these were on your follow-up listens or just the main list, but Warlord did stand out to me because it was the debut EP Deliver Us, which, if I'm not mistaken, was somewhat anomalous in their discography because it was slightly different to the debut album, which I didn't actually listen to, but I was just reading about it. But it's like a half-hour EP. It's almost as long as an album,
Yeah.
and to the point around the whole power metal label. It's it kind of almost stands out within the bands that we're talking about here for being a lot more low key in its delivery. It's a lot more kind of ethereal. It's more medieval. A lot of the melodies feel like they're pulled from sort of medieval and early music, which gives it this kind of mystical kind of feel. Also a bit like folky, and I think to some
Mhm.
extent, it feels almost like it's drawing on some of the kind of folkier elements of 70s prog as well. It's
Yeah,
got a
I
similar kind of vibe.
Warlord for me, like when I hear it, like when I think of like where they come from, definitely are coming from the Rainbow and maybe even a little bit of Yes,
Yes.
as big influences on them. And you can hear that even with the keyboards. I think that's certainly something. And weirdly, I think Warlord sticks out a little bit in that it's very much U.S. power metal. And again, the other thing for people coming into this with not much sense of this genre, like a lot of stuff like first wave of black metal, these are very amorphous genres. These are not genres that were really set in stone. And even thrash metal, I think, wasn't really until the late '80s. Really kind of rules were set
Yeah.
in stone. So the one thing to notice is that there's a lot of variation with these bands. And Warlord for me is one that certainly sticks out as hinting at sort of where some like even European power metal bands would go with the symphonic aspects and also kind of the medieval folkish aspects.
Yeah, it feels like although the time frame is quite tight here because we've got several albums released within the space of a couple of years, but it
Mhm.
feels like a very much an early text in the formation of this genre in the same way that you listen to fuck it, like early Sabbath. And as we discussed on the Black Sabbath episode, like you do still get a lot of the music of the previous decade still there, and it's
Mhm.
sort of slowly stripped out as they evolve. But also, it's difficult listening to this older music now without like imposing a teleology onto it, for want of a better word, in that we know
Right.
that it's
Yeah.
we know that it's evolving somewhere, and this is like an early stroke at it. But obviously, at the time, they didn't have a crystal ball. They were just writing, drawing on the music that inspired them, and this is where they ended up. The fact that it became quite an early kind of example of this genre is kind of by the by, but it definitely is with hindsight. You mentioned like the keyboards. I think that's a really important element that is kind of um, one of the other things that kind of sets US power metal apart is most of the other bands don't tend to use keyboards, or they do so very sparingly, whereas the European bands do use them quite a bit. But yeah, as I said, it feels a bit more what's the word? Just a bit more innocent in some ways, which I quite like. And then I was contrasting that with yeah, Manowar, Ride into Glory, which I don't know, man. I've never really tried with Manowar because I just know that they're not for me. And I think listening to
Yeah.
this and their debut was kind of just confirmed that suspicion to me. It's just one of those bands. So I'm just like, I'm not, not going to stop anyone from liking them, but I'm also like, oh man,
Yeah.
that's just the part of metal that I just never really understood.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing with like I mentioned, they've become their own thing. But certainly at the time, very much embodied. I mean, you even look at the cover, they're very much doing the Conan the Barbarian, like B-rated movie, like ripoff of it. And there is a very if you're not the person who can eliminate all irony in your reflection, if anyone looks up the video for Gloves of Metal, is very cheesy. But at the same time, I thoroughly enjoy it, and I think alongside Maiden, um, Manowar does serve musically kind of a purpose in very much giving sort of the gallop in music a real sense of place and purpose. And you can, find that throughout metal onward. The other interesting thing with Manowar is the bass used is, I think, Joe DiMaio uses a piccolo bass, which gives kind of a higher register, which so it almost sounds like a more bassy guitar along with the main guitar. Um, so those are interesting elements with that, but it's not for everyone in the same sense that I wouldn't be like, yeah, anyone can get into King Diamond. There's nothing stopping you. It it has its particularities. The one thing I'll say is Manowar is very relevant. Again, with I think with the galloping riff, very relevant to where a lot of later metal went, and certainly if one is a fan of Viking era Bathory and even things like Primordial and stuff like that, I think you have to look at Manowar and see where a lot of those elements came from.
Yeah, I've read that about Bathory before. Although Corfin has always been
No,
quite
he
mysterious about it.
yeah,
But
he denied it, but in the same way that, like, sure, he wrote the first Bathory album and had no idea who Venom were. Sure.
yeah,
I
well, I
feel
also
like
read.
for the Viking era, that was Manowar.
Yeah, I think one of the drummers he worked with did say like, yeah, I was listening to a lot of Manowar at the time, and it would have rubbed off on him. But yeah, definitely agree with the Viking thing in general. And yeah, bands like Primordial. But I guess yeah, the early Manowar is not like abrasive. It's just kind of rough and ready heavy metal. But I guess
Mhm.
that's almost what's made it stand out to me is the surprising thing, and one of the reasons that I sort of got quite so into this is a lot of these bands, even if you don't like them, they have something about them. Whereas Manowar, I mean, it's probably not fair because there's just been that kind of style, like you said, the galloping heavy metal style has become such a fixed point, and it's been done so much, where it's influenced so many other bands that it's probably not fair to sort of dismiss the origins of it. But it does, the early Manowar does feel quite a lot more generic than a lot of this stuff. I like contrasting it to Warlord, but even something like the Manila Road as well. Again, on paper, quite a simple band, but also you listen to, well, it's Crystal Logic was the one you initially recommended, and I think we have done that on a
Yeah.
previous tier list episode. But it's an odd album,
Oh
in
yeah.
a lot of ways. It's sort of feels like I don't know, um, again, almost like a folk band playing heavy metal, or a band that wants to just tell these like, yeah, dreamy kind of folk narratives, but it's sort of, yeah, done in this heavy metal gauge. And then you also said maybe check out, was it the next album, Open the Gates, and that sort of hits a lot
Mhm.
harder. It's more like classically metal in a lot of ways. So yeah, they're another one where obviously I've been aware of them. They are pretty famous out of this sort of selection, but they're quite an odd sort of unusual band, but it's quite hard to put my finger on why, because what they're doing isn't that different to a lot of the other bands, but they just have a weird way of going
Well,
about it sometimes. But
I definitely can speak on to that. The I mean, it's interesting because on the Ride into Glory site, they actually kind of do a caveat where they're like, we're going to include them in the US power metal, but they're kind of their own thing, along with a couple other bands. Like he calls them epic metal in comparison. And Manila Road, it's interesting and very similarly to Cirith Ungol, who I know I recommended. I think their second album, King of the Dead, for this. Although I just as well could have done One Foot in Hell. Um, but unlike some of the other bands who were very much, I feel like, coming directly, like their most immediate influence of like, we need to start a band was probably hearing new wave of British heavy metal. Cirith Ungol and Manila Road are older guys. Like at least the original guys in those bands generally got started in the 70s. Cirith Ungol, I mean, I think when they were a high school band, we're looking at like early to mid 70s. Um, and I've been fortunate enough to talk to those guys, and a lot of like the reason they started playing music was stuff like Atomic Rooster, Captain Beyond, a lot of what we call like somewhat these days obscure 70s proto metal, Mountain, um, beyond just things like, Rainbow and Led Zeppelin. Um, and you can hear that in the earliest recordings. There's definitely a bit more of a rock, especially in the first Cirith Ungol album. But in Manila Road, before Crystal Logic, there is a lot where it at times feels like Hawkwind. It feels like something very 70s. Captain Beyond certainly plays into it. And it's really not till the second album, Metal, go figure, it kind of starts leaning more to that. And Crystal Logic, I think, is where it starts becoming more than 50%. Like it's closer to 75%, like something closer to the new wave of British heavy metal. But because it's very much rooted in kind of slightly esoteric 70s stuff, it has kind of a weird vibe to it. And I think that lingers throughout their career. Um, and that definitely sets both of those bands kind of apart from the rest of the scene.
yeah, I mean, I'm way more familiar with Cirith Ungol. I've been into them for quite a long time, but they've always been
Mhm.
anomalous in like just one of the sort of select heavy metal bands, traditional heavy metal bands that appear in my collection. And I think it is because of that vibe that you're talking about is you can link it back to 70s rock, but it also reaches forward into, as I think we discussed before, into doom metal. Um,
Mhm.
and they tick a lot of boxes in terms of being quite weird and rough. Obviously, the vocals take some getting used to. The production is sometimes a bit all over the place, but they're also just they surmount all of those things, and they're incredibly creative in the way they tell stories and what they do. Not so much the debut, I would say. That's more of just a straight up heavy metal album, boner metal, as I sometimes call it. But I get a similar vibe from Manila Road, circa like Crystal Logic. Definitely agree
Mhm.
with sort of what you're saying in terms of like the Hawkwind element as well. The 70s is still very much there, and I guess from one angle they could look quite wimpy when compared to bands like the Jag Panzer or the Manowar and so on. But that's kind of not what they're interested in. They're more interested in telling these stories, and then slowly kind of absorbing the language of heavy metal as the decade progressed. The other thing I wanted to just I don't know. It's just something I thought of when you mentioned that both these bands were a little bit older than some of the other ones we're
Mhm.
discussing, is drawing a parallel with that and bands like St. Vitus and Pentagram, who were also quite a bit
Yeah.
older than when they started getting going. I know Pentagram have been going since the early 70s. The guys in St. Vitus were also quite a bit older. And, it's way more obvious them absorbing the 70s style in their music but never really sort of getting going with recording albums until the 80s. But it's an interesting kind of parallel evolution. And obviously we don't lump them in with US power metal because they are definitely very sonically different. But it's just coming back to this kind of parallel worlds thing that I keep referring to. It's just an interesting. It's interesting how these different artists kind of absorbed that journey and digested it in different ways, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um,
Another kind of an odd twist with Manilla Road. Um, they were label mates with kind of an obscure label called Black Dragon Records, but shared a lot of space with essentially Candlemass, who were on there, especially for Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus. And I think that that album weirdly feels like a cousin to kind of that peak Manilla Road era, in kind of sticking out from the crowd and kind of being its own thing. I mean, obviously, Candlemass in a lot of ways are attributed to starting epic doom metal, and again, go figure with the characterization Manilla Road is starting epic metal. Yeah, it's. I think it's just interesting noting that they had close relations as bands in a way, and they both had this influence on the scene.
yeah. And again, it depends on how you want to cut the cloth, I suppose, because there are metal bands that are lean into the stereotypes of metal. Going back to someone like Manowar, it is just
Yeah.
chest beating, and very direct and energetic. But there has always been this alternative strain, and you could look at this through any genre. Like you could say, contrast a band like Atheist with Cannibal Corpse, say, and
Mm-hmm.
or a band like, I don't know, Summoning with Marduk or something like that, where you just have
Yeah.
two sides of the same coin, two very different interpretations. But I also think very different characters getting into it, who are, the sort of the more insular, geeky, thoughtful. And that's not to say that you can't play aggressive music that's also thoughtful. Obviously, this is kind of a simplistic binary, but it does speak to the different things that people were getting from this music at the time. And I think that's kind of borne out in the contrast already here within these bands is the different interpretation they're bringing to it, whether they are bringing more of a sort of light touch, folky vibe and getting more lost in their own little world, or whether they are sort of writing more kind of Saturday night drinking music to some extent. Which does bring us neatly onto the Jag Panzer, which the Ride into Glory article was sort of, I think is the one they couldn't praise enough, in terms of just this is the album that you need to
Yeah.
listen to understand the style. Because I was listening to it and thinking, oh yeah, this is definitely that chest beating side of metal. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's raw, it's energetic. Yes, it is still fantasy, but it's, as you said, it's definitely on the pulpy side. It's barbaric and basic and themic. But then it gets surprisingly complex as the album progresses, and some of the arrangements become really quite intricate in a way that I wasn't really expecting. And this just speaks to the fact that all of these albums and all of these artists do have something to them. They are all quite distinguishable, even sort of coming at it, fresh, listening to a lot of these albums for the first time. There is something surprising about it. So yeah, this album was definitely like a bit of a curveball to me as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed that one.
I actually just had the fortune, and so did anyone else who attended the Hell's Heroes Festival, because Jag Panzer came and played that album in full.
Oh, okay.
So that was nice, and they it it's they're an odd band in that they did an EP that album, and then they kind of disappeared off the map for 10 years, and then they came back like in the late 90s, and kind of shifted in some ways to more of a modern type of power metal band in some ways, or but yeah, that the first album and the EP really stand out, and are pretty unique in that, and so it was pretty cool to see them perform that,
Mm.
and I'll hopefully have an article coming out reviewing that. But I think I commented at the time that it was interesting watching a bunch of guys in their 50s and 60s in black shirts and leather pants, who normally, you just set up the premise and it sounds like it's going to be awful, but the alchemy of that music playing and those guys knowing how to play it so well just seemed to transport everyone to this other realm of, unironic metal glory where we could just ignore the fact that there were a bunch of guys with senior citizen discounts and leather pants singing, playing guitar at us.
So we will come to that, not just in reference to Hell's Heroes, but also the what's the word? Anachronistic element to not just US power metal, but a lot of traditional forms of heavy metal. But
Mm-hmm.
also what I was thinking just then as well, in terms of them releasing one album and then disappearing. And we mentioned some of the sort of breakout acts that got famous later on. Um,
Yeah.
but one of the other things that occurred to me is like a lot of this music, was it quite obscure at the time? Like, it's particularly in America. I think that's what I wanted to touch on as well, because we talk about, yeah, obviously some of this stuff getting massive in Germany. It was obviously already massive in the UK. Um, but in America, it took a while for, well, I don't know if you ever really came around to heavy metal in the same way as we did in Europe, mostly because by the mid 80s, thrash was getting insanely big, but also the hair metal thing, like bands like Motley Crue and stuff, were kind of taking up all of the oxygen in terms of that style, and it was quite easy to just be lumped in with them, even though you're playing, quite a distinctive, different kind of music in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think for each band it depends, and obviously the ones like Queensrÿche and Fate's Warning definitely continued and got bigger and kind of grew out of it, but like the ones that kind of are limited in some way to that time and then maybe came back later. Jag Panzer being a perfect example. I think Omen is, as well. um I there was part of a burgeoning metal scene post new wave of British heavy metal, and thrash and speed and the proto death were all part of that. And you certainly have cases of bands where things sometimes just did not work out, whether it was the personalities in the band imploding before a break could come or just keep on trying and a lucky break not coming. Like I think the guys in Cirith Ungol would certainly joke that bad luck followed them at every left and right turn, to the point where they, for a long time just refused to get back together because they just thought the black cat was ready to walk across their path as soon as they did. Um, and it took quite a bit for them to really kind of reform.
Mm.
So yeah, I think, in the same thing, you look at the history of new wave of British heavy metal, like you go back and, again, Angel Witch, a band that really could have been so much bigger, but because of one thing or another thing, just stuff imploding, not working, and other bands. I mean, like a really obscure new wave of British heavy metal band. I mean, I really like Jaguar. I really enjoy a few others that just, kind of have one album, maybe a collection of singles and EPs, and that's about it. And even Satan, like, I mean, that was a band that wasn't, I certainly got bigger after they got back together. Um,
Yeah,
so I think it
definitely.
was
Yeah.
just the luck of the draw of sometimes not being in the right place at the right time.
Mm.
And I think that's the case with a lot of those bands. And then when you had such a massive shift, especially in American culture, where I think it didn't hit Europe quite as bad, but the shift into grunge, like hair metal got killed, but if you weren't like really, really heavy thrash, and even then, some of those bands had a hard time with it. Like if you weren't Metallica or Slayer, um, you know, or someone like Anthrax, where you shifted into, the hip hop and also shifted into grunge somewhat with the John Bush era. But like a lot of bands just got destroyed when Nirvana and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains came out. Um, like the scene changed. I think what American radio and even college radio was interested in just immediately changed. And some bands suffered the fortunes of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and that's kind of comes back to what I was talking about at the opening in terms of this sounding so dated even before I'd started listening to metal proper, for want of a better word. Like,
Mhm.
because I was getting into music at the tail end of that grunge explosion. Um, so the early 2000s, we're still living with the legacy of that. New metal had kind of exploded, which was essentially an offshoot of that, and alt
Yeah.
metal and lots of varieties of that. So most of the bands that were big at this time were in some sense dealing with grunge, whether it was a post-grunge thing like fucking Creed
Mhm.
or Bush and things like that, or mention Bush like straight up just trying to rip Nirvana off essentially, or
Yeah.
definitely the new metal thing, and just in that culture, whenever you came across a sound that sounded like this classic heavy metal style, it was always as a send up or as a parody, which is why I think mentioning something like Dragon Force as a bit of a, well, not a watershed moment, but a moment when that kind of was first brought to my attention in some way, because you mentioned like, yeah, they were a bit meta at the time, but they were also like very invested in it, and a lot of people did really get into them, whether they were doing it ironically or not. But it was the first time it's like, oh yeah, that sound is really annoying to me, and I need to interrogate why. Because at the time I was getting into black metal and thinking
Yeah.
like, even something like Iron Maiden was like a step too far, and it wasn't until like years
Mhm.
later that I was like, actually, I do need to go back to listen to a lot of this, because it is that DNA is still in a lot of the music that I like. So yeah, it's interesting that um, just that I guess that explosion of like three or four bands out of Seattle kind of just completely changed how we perceive some of this music. And I mentioned like on the chat before we started recording, like um, it does feel very tied to time and place as a result of that. And that's not just true of US power metal,
Mhm.
but heavy metal in general, in the way that something like Transylvanian Hunger or Burzum's first run of albums doesn't doesn't feel like you're listening to 90s music in a sense. To a lesser extent, death metal. I think Scott Burns style death metal does kind of sound sort of 90s, or maybe that's me kind of projecting onto it, but it still feels, for want of a better word, timeless in a way that classic heavy metal just always does, just pinpoint it to this period in like early to mid 80s, and it just immediately evokes all of these images in my mind in the same way as like classic jazz might do so, or even some classical symphonies might do so. And you kind of have to almost divorce yourself from that, or as you were talking about with that Jag Panzer gig, like embrace it to some extent and kind of forget about the squeamishness that a modern ear might have to some of this and just look past that. Because as I said, digging into some of these albums, there's always something kind of interesting and flamboyant about them. Maybe not so much with the Omen Battle Cry, which is the next one I have on my list. I did enjoy it as like a
Mhm.
straight up hard hitting heavy metal album, but it was, along with the Manowar, maybe one of the less interesting ones on here. But yeah, that was just me. But yeah.
Um, I mean, I feel Battlecry goes so. Some of the Omen albums after it are a little bit more smooth. I guess. I've always thoroughly enjoyed them.
I mean, I'll qualify that. It was a fun album. I definitely had fun
Yeah.
listening to it at the very least. But
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the one thing, and it's easy for me to notice this because they played two full album sets last year's Hell's Heroes because they had to help out when another band dropped off. So they played all of Battle Cry and then they played all of Warning of Danger, which had the anniversary that year. Um, and personally, I prefer Battle Cry, but Battle Cry definitely has a sing alongness to it. Like the choruses are catchy as fuck, and it works fantastically when you're in a live setting. So that kind of sets it a bit apart, but it is at the same time. for, US power metal, it's still pretty, rough on the edges. Like it's still very much like it's a sing-along album that at the same time, it was released on Metal Blade and kind of goes pretty well with something like Slayer Show No Mercy.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think, if you didn't know anything about this era of metal and you gave someone this list of albums and you snuck Show No Mercy in there, it would fit in. Like it would
Yeah.
feel like easily like a part of this kind of crop of bands. Maybe
Well,
to
and when you get to, I was just going to say, when you get to another one that I'm assuming you listen to because I think I mentioned is one of the first five, but there's another one that has a very direct tie-in, um, even more than Omen to Slayer and Metal Blade. But I
well,
mean, you
I'll carry on then. I'll skip over the Manilla Road and Cirith Ungol because we kind of discussed them. We've mentioned
mhm.
Armored Saint. Um,
Yes,
this is the one I kind of had the least to say about. It's not that I didn't enjoy it. And I've heard of Armored Saint. They're another name that just floats around the ether, but I'd never really listened to them that much. But this felt the closest to the British style to me, not just because the album's called March of the Saint and it's got a very clear kind of medieval sort of vibe on the cover with the knights and so on, but it
yeah,
felt like not a throwback because it's probably too early to call it a throwback because it was released in 1984, but it felt like it pulled the heaviest from the new wave of British heavy metal to me in a lot of ways.
yeah, and like I mentioned, I mean, they were an LA band. I mean, you got John Bush there, and like Armored Saint are interesting that like they're a band who grew up and were brewing with essentially the height of what you would think is LA and California thrash metal scene, yet sort of persisted in being like, well, we're not going to do that. Like we love all these bands and we're going to play alongside these bands, but we're still kind of going to stick it closer to like a Judas Priest Dio kind of thing. Um, at the same time, they got pretty complex as it went on. I mean, and they were, one of those few bands, which is why I think, later on when Anthrax was looking for a replacement for a singer, that, John Bush seems so appealing. Because they did kind of make that transition into like the early 90s, sort of darker, but still a heavy metal band, kind of still surviving the grunge wave with like Symbol of Salvation. That just all fell apart though when John was given the offer to join Anthrax. But you see that continue on. Um, so they're an interesting band in that. March of the Saint is probably the most clearly definable US power metal album. It's still very close to the themes in US power metal. And like I mentioned before, like I mean, there's I think in the music video for Can You Deliver, I think they're riding around on motorcycles in medieval armor. So it's, you know, they definitely epitomize briefly the vibe.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting as well because I forgot that there's the LA connection. Um, in terms of you have, these three different branches of what is essentially still heavy metal. You've got the early thrash bands, you've got, as I mentioned, like hair metal, glam metal, and then you've
Yeah.
got what is still sort of sticking with the traditional sound. It must have been so annoying. I mean, it still is quite annoying when, layman's kind of ask you, what kind of music are you into, or what kind of music do you play if you're in a band, and you sort of spout off
Yeah.
the most sort of generic label, or we play heavy metal, and they just immediately associate it with something that's just definitely not that. And all of these,
Yeah. Motley Crue or, I
yeah,
mean,
and all
the
these,
interesting thing with the LA bands is that, I mean, you did kind of have that still mixing. Like, I'm sure, like, I think you see this certainly, like, Metallica in '84 toured with Wasp, and Wasp certainly was like the hardest of the quote unquote glam bands. But, I don't think it would be that surprising to see, if you went back to the mid '80s, finding like Armored Saint playing with Wasp, or even playing with like a band like Rad, or some of the other bands on the Strip. it's not like clubs were only playing hair metal. Like if you went to the Roxy or a lot of the legendary venues like the Whiskey A Go Go in LA on the Strip, I think a lot of these bands were intermixing.
Well, I'd
Um,
have to because the scene just wasn't big enough at the time,
yeah, to
and they
to
probably
support just one
shared
thing.
fans. But yeah,
Yeah. Like I think even you hear stories from like some of the Motley Crue guys, they said like LA was so crazy and an evening like Friday night on the strip was so wild because you saw people from all sorts of different scenes intermixing.
yeah, yeah, that too. Um, So yeah, the next one on the list is the Metal Church, which I did mention briefly, but I do want to
Mhm.
circle back to it because I did actually see Metal Church a few years ago at a Brutal Assault, and yeah, there are another of these bands that just the name is always floating around, and I've never really actually just stuck on one of their albums. But as I mentioned, this one was surprisingly heavy. But in the Riding to Glory article, he makes a couple of distinctions between what we're calling the more barbaric, rougher side, which is definitely like
Mhm.
the Omen and the Jag Panzer and stuff, and the more progressive side, which Queensrÿche and Fate's Warning being the obvious two. And for me, this
Yeah.
one, it starts out as a thrash album, and then it kind of bridges the gap between these two to some extent. For me, there were, like I said, there was a ballad number in there, but it also got quite technical in places. But it's also incredibly like energetic and raw and heavy at the same time. Um, so it felt like the sort of bridge release and quite a nice contrast across the album as well. And another one that was just surprisingly varied in a way that new wave of British heavy metal albums aren't, with some obvious exceptions. But one of the problems
Mhm.
I have with a band like Saxon, for instance, is I love a good chunk of their songs from the first three albums, but they're patchy albums that you have to get through some stuff that's
Yeah,
just
some
quite generic
clunkers.
and yeah.
I
Um,
I sometimes feel that way with like Accept, although probably less so than with Saxon. Like Saxon at times has songs that are straight up like an AC/DC song.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
I feel a similar thing about something like Witchfinder General in that some of their songs are
yeah,
great, some of them are not laughable, but they're pretty hard to swallow. Whereas, yeah, a lot of these albums, like they have their weirdness and their quirks, but they're more interesting to listen to than, yeah, bands that are just sort of, yeah, doing another kind of, as you said, like AC/DC basic rock and roll thing intercut with some more proto heavy metal elements. But yeah, the Metal
yeah.
Church, yeah, thoroughly enjoyable listen that one.
Metal Church is interesting in that, you know, uh, they came from the Seattle scene. Um, and the only other major band from that was Queensryche as well. Um, and obviously Queensryche went on to far much bigger and brighter things, but there's some similarities in that the thrash and speed scene clearly had an influence, but they at the same time were still very much in love with new wave of British heavy metal and weren't gonna drive too far away from the Maiden and Priest sound. But at the same time, Metal Church, I feel like has some rather unique traits to it. There's also quite a bit of a darkness to it, to the feel of it. Um, I mean, it's funny because the second album, which is almost as good, is literally just called The Dark. Um, and but yeah, it's a very interesting release. And that band in general, I thoroughly enjoy the first three albums, but after that, it does get a little kind of because the lineup changes, and again, dealing with the '90s, they didn't. They tried to make the transition like in '89, and they kind of did well, but I think things really kind of fell apart in the same way like Exodus post 1991 wasn't doing great. Um, yeah, they're an interesting band. In some ways, I would also compare them, though they went in a very different direction and kept on going, was something like Savatage in terms of being a pretty unique band and also not coming from the usual places. And that Metal Church came from Seattle and Savatage came from Florida. And the interesting thing with Savatage is I think a lot of, and I think this is noted that a lot of like the Florida death metal bands went to their shows like back in the day in the 80s, and they actually had a bit of an influence on the Florida death metal scene,
Yeah, I
which
think that
you would
definitely came
not
up.
think musically, but
No, that definitely came up when I was reading the Scott Burns book. I think Savatage was mentioned a few times, just because, yeah,
yeah.
you wouldn't think of pre death metal, you wouldn't think of Tampa as a hotbed of heavy metal. But yeah, on the oh, there was something you said about the metal church that oh yeah, just the 90s being a weird ass decade for some of these bands.
Mhm.
And all of them coping differently. But oh no, it's because you mentioned Exodus, and I was just thinking their debut
Yeah.
also makes more sense to me now as well. I obviously knew that I would kind of put it in the same category as, well, the other American thrash bands debut, in terms of there's still a lot more heavy metal in all of them. Kill 'Em All,
Hmm.
Show No Mercy as well, but Bond by Blood is definitely feels like it could fit on this list as well. It's much more of a heavy metal album than a
Yeah.
thrash album in a lot of ways.
And that's a bit of a tangent, but I mean that is a good point in that I mean the material on Bonded by Blood almost goes back to like 82, 83. Like some of that stuff was written by when Kirk Hammett was still in the band. And they just were kind of unfortunate where they couldn't get that album out. Like I think it was supposed to come out in 84 and it got delayed again. Like that was an album that could have been right there with Kill 'Em All and Show No Mercy. It was just unfortunate circumstances pushed that to 85. So it felt like a later release where already, other bands had their debuts out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, we're talking like, yeah, a couple of years. It's not that long in the grand scheme of things, but it's amazing how
No.
much difference it makes. I think I
Yeah.
can make a similar point around Massacre's debut as well, which I think came out in '92. But Massacre were obviously one of the earlier bands, and yeah, they just couldn't get
Hmm.
a lineup together in time, so it ended up sounding quite sort of generic death metal by that time. But that's a massive tangent. We're in Seattle, so we're moving on to Queensrÿche.
Hmm.
I'm very familiar with an album like Operation Mindcrime. For some reason, I'd just never gone back to their earlier material, although I was, aware that they were much more closely kind of linked to what I, consider sort of more traditional heavy metal. Operation Mindcrime is kind of a blend of that and more stadium rock, I guess, folded into just this giant, elaborate,
Yeah, and
ambitious concept album. But yeah.
yeah, I mean, definitely something like, uh, when you think of the progressive rock aspect of Queensryche, I think something like Genesis and Peter Gabriel is certainly fits into where they were with Mindcrime.
Yeah, and well, to some extent, you can hear that on the Warning as well,
Yeah,
because there are some longer songs on here. Obviously, the
yeah, I
vocal.
would say like, yeah, I mean, if anyone's familiar with Genesis, like Warning, you could kind of compare almost to like, what the hell is like the second or third Genesis album, but like a Nursery Rhyme.
Nursery Crimes, yeah.
Yeah, Nursery Crime, and like yeah, I definitely feel like the musical box, like you can kind of see that with like the early Queensryche, and then, but by the time of like Operation Mindcrime, you're looking at something like, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
Um, yeah, and with this as well, it is an interesting mix of the more USPM elements that we've already been discussing. Definitely the frog element is already there. Also, the fact that they have such a powerful vocalist means that
Hmm.
music does bend towards the vocals to a greater extent. And we did actually discuss this on a much earlier episode, I think of Necropolis, where we're discussing Dio um, Sabbath era, where although I do appreciate those albums and I think they are great, to some extent the riffing kind of Iommi has to hold back a little bit because he's working with a much more sort of technically competent vocalist who can do much
Hmm.
more with his voice. So it has to kind of centralize the voice a little bit more, and that's also kind of true with Queensryche to some extent because you do have a very talented band in general that can do some very elaborate arrangements and quite complex music, but sometimes it feels like it holds back for the sake of the vocals, which is no bad thing because this is one case where the vocals are ambitious, but they can actually kind of fulfill that to a great extent, famously so. But it puts the emphasis in a slightly different place for me and makes it a slightly more tentative album compared to some of the other stuff. It feels like they're still kind of working things out. Um,
Mhm.
and I wouldn't go as far as to say like they're the sort of Def Leppard of this scene, but it does feel like they're wanting to go in a much more kind of bombastic commercial direction, but they're still got the competence to sort of play much more like avant-garde or alienating music, but they almost don't want to some extent. I don't know if that makes any sense what I just said, but
No, I mean certainly for a certain extent. Like they like again, like the difference between you know what, like 3 or 4 years going from the Warning to Operation Mindcrime with one album essentially in between. What was it, an 86 Reach for Order. Um, yeah, you can say they had ambitions to try even bigger and crazier things. I mean, there's still, there's a bordering on 10-minute long song with Roads to Madness on The Warning. Earlier, I mentioned like its progressive nature, especially with guitar playing, at times feels somewhat comparable to like Merciful Fate, especially in like Don't Break the Oath. Um, both albums coming out in '84. They kind of, certain albums have sibling feelings, like they just kind of work well together, and I always feel like these two definitely do. Um, it's funny you mentioned, like, not that I want to bridge immediately into it, but you mentioned how it seems like here instrumentally they're still kind of giving space to Jeff Tate because he is such a talent and really kind of going out there with it, that they don't want to step on his toes. You compare that to, say, Fate's Warning with Spectre Within, where I feel like no one is caring about stepping on anyone's toes. They're just both sides going at it.
so that does conclude our discussion of 1984, and that is seven albums, and that's obviously not a comprehensive list. So 1984
Yep.
was definitely the year for this style. But yes, Fate's Warning, Spectre Within is the next album I have on my list, and I know it's not an original observation, but my God, the vocals, like, um, it reminded
Yeah,
me of I don't think this is particularly original either, but a band that I've really struggled to get into is Watchtower for very similar reasons. They're slightly more on the thrashy side, but very technical, very
yeah,
meandering, and the same kind of falsetto vocals that try to weave their way in and out with the riffs. And yeah, they just end up. I've just about cracked it with Watchtower, I think, but Fate's Warning, again, another band very aware of. They're obviously one of the bands that, as you mentioned, transcended the scene to some extent, and they're just a household name now. But these albums are notorious for what's the singer's name? Sorry,
John Arch,
that's
who
it.
was on the first three albums, and then I forget what was the story, whether he quit or was replaced,
Because it's not
but yeah,
just
he's
it's not just the style. It's very high and
oh
almost
yeah,
relentless, but in a way, something like Cirith Ungol, you could argue that they're equally abrasive, but he tries to do less with his voice. He kind of just he does sing some melodies, but he kind of just bellows them. Whereas in the Fates Warning, he tries to go toe to toe with the quite intricate guitar lines in terms of doing something
yeah,
equally intricate, and that also leads to some very weird phrasing in that words and sentences kind of he pronounces them quite strangely to make them fit, and you kind of have to wrap your mind around it. But obviously, it takes quite a few goes to get in that space, and if you're not inclined to do so, you would just immediately think, well, no, this is not for me.
yeah.
Like,
I
which
mean,
is a shame because it is really good
yeah,
musically. Like it really is like
yeah.
an interesting progressive metal album.
No, if you're looking for some of the most intricate 80s guitar playing, definitely, I mean, Jim Matthews on this and the follow-up album, Wig in the Guardian, which only came out 1 year later. It's definitely pinnacles of the 80s in terms of that. And then, like I mentioned, they went on, especially after John Arch left, to become in some ways, like I almost consider like a proto Dream Theater in terms of progressive metal. And I'm not the biggest fan of those albums. Like I really do just kind of stick to the John Arch era. Um, and it's interesting you mentioned Watchtower because Watchtower is a band it's sort of the reverse. I still have a hard time really getting into that one, whereas Fate's Warning, I've kind of been able to easier, and I'm sure it's just the circumstances when I was exposed to certain things. Um, yeah, it's interesting though because again, you hear something like, "Oh, Fate's Warning," and if your first exposure is by the 90s or the 2000s, like you check out whatever's the album you can find, and it's probably one of the ones from the 90s that was very, or late 80s, that's very prog metal. And then all of a sudden you hear something from the John Arch era, it can be a bit of a shock as to like, whoa, like they were actually a really kind of cutting band, like where the riffs are not dull, which isn't to say that the prog rock era is dull, just extremely, I feel like, manicured. Whereas Fate's Warning, as complicated as it was in the Arch era, it it it's hard to say, but just like it was not concerned about um running into the corners at a dangerous speed. Let's put it that way.
Well, it's also yeah, it's technical, but it's not polished. I mean, even pointing to something like the
Yeah.
production is quite, it's still quite a like basic package in terms of, you know, yeah, drums, guitars. There's not much like in the way of heavy-handed mixing going on. As you said, I haven't listened to the later albums you're referring to, but you mentioned that they're manicured. This is not a manicured album in any sense,
No.
even setting aside the vocals. It could be quite a kind of yeah, down the barrel like heavy metal mix. It just so happens that they're playing quite complex, dense music at the same time. But you're right, like it's definitely communicated through the riffs and the kind of interweaving rhythms and so on. It's not just relying on guitar solos and building to that. And as mentioned, the vocals. I mean, you can criticize it all you want, but it's undeniably ambitious in that the kind of giants of developing the metal crooner style. They tended not to step on each other's toes. Like Priest were famous for the dual guitar leads and Halford's voice, but they balanced each other out, and they each song had the set piece moment where Halford got to show off, and then the guitars would do their thing. Whereas here, everyone's trying to do it at the same time, which is quite an interesting idea. It's quite an ambitious way to go about it and say, like, can't we kind of marry the two and have things happening concurrently, like you would like a contrapuntal piece of Baroque music or something in a way. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously a matter of opinion and taste whether you think they pull it off or not, but you can't deny that that kind of thing hadn't really been attempted in metal proper. You could say, yeah, the prog bands tried to do it, but to a lot of people, they're every bit as abrasive as something like Fate's Warning. So,
Yeah. And one thing, before we jump into anything else to mention with this album, like some of these albums, I had sort of interesting introductions. Like some of them came much later for me, but this one was a bit earlier, all thanks to a movie. Because I guess you could call it the single off of this song, Kyrie Eleison, was paired together with a bunch of Slayer tracks, Hollow's Eve, which is a very obscure band, and the punk band's Agent Orange and Wipers on the soundtrack for the movie River's Edge. And I saw that movie, I think, when I was still in high school. And that is a very strange little indie film from the 80s that starred Keanu Reeves and Crispin Glover very early on in their careers, although kind of like, I think, after like Bill and Ted. And it's a very weird movie. I mean, Dennis Hopper's in it as well, who plays one of his weirder selves. I mean, it's Crispin Glover who, is very much known for the weird. And it's such a, like, you listen to you watch that movie, and then all of a sudden you're hit with like Crispin Glover in the car with his buddy, and they're listening to that Fate's Warning track, and then Slayer, and you're like, what the hell is this?
Okay, I'll have to check that one out. I've not come across that before.
Oh, definitely. I mean, we can. I'll have to like that, and maybe a couple other movies with like very unique metal soundtracks, especially in the '80s. That would be a good episode.
Yeah, definitely. Um, cool. So yeah, the next one on my list. So I think that was the only pick from '85. We moved on to '86 with the Crimson Glory. But
Mhm.
this kind of fit in with the Fates Warning discussion in that
Yeah.
it felt like a more, I don't want to say commercial, but maybe a more palatable version of Fates Warning in that it's very flamboyant, quite eclectic in terms of the moods and the different kind of themes that it hits on. But it is a mix of the technical aspects, but also it does have its anthemic, catchy moments, but with a slightly more meandering kind of thing going on at the same time. It's sort of weaving together what Fates Warning were doing with a more commercial ear, I suppose. And that also leads on to a more broader discussion about the fact that this being 86, we've moved on 3 years from the earlier stuff. Things are starting to become more like polished, and I don't want to say self-aware necessarily, but maybe bands are more aware of what each other are doing within the scene. They're obviously observing what thrash bands are doing because they couldn't really get away from them by this point. They were getting quite big, but they're also very aware of the evolution of metal at this time. Bands like Iron Maiden had sort of taken over the world. And there
Mhm.
is a sense that the American bands are upping their game from a technical and production point of view to kind of go toe to toe with some of this. And I think the Crimson Glory kind of definitely, just in listening to all of these albums, definitely kind of brought that element to the fore in my mind in terms of like yeah, just that the American bands raising their game to some extent. But I think it is a successful mix of the more what's the word I'm looking for? Pleasing to the ear, while still being very musically
Um,
interesting.
like highly melodic or
Yeah, yeah,
harmonic focused. I mean, very much in the vein of Maiden, but you know, uh, right into Glory talks about kind of how you can kind of view the bands, and again, a lot of them don't fit neatly into these distinctions, but the ones that leaned a little more either progressive or highly melodic. And I think you mentioned Crimson Glory as like maybe the pinnacle example of that, where maybe not too proggy, maybe not too like overly melodic to the point of like sounding like more like European power metal. Just kind of like that Goldilocks for the proggy melodic side of the genre.
yeah. I think that's quite a good way to characterize it as well. Um, and I'm going to move on to the Savatage now, unless you have anything else to say on the Crimson Glory.
No, I like that album. I like Crimson Glory. Unfortunately, out of all the different realms in bands in this era, it's not the one I've had the longest time with, so I don't have the most to say about them. Whereas with Savatage, I actually can say quite a bit.
So Savatage are another one that I was definitely aware of. Like I said, they came up in the Scott Burns book because they're from Tampa. Um,
Yep.
so this is Hall of the Mountain King that we're discussing, which I think is it a third album?
Fourth,
Fourth.
maybe. Yeah, I think
So I was looking into it, and the
fifth if
one
it counted the EP, but yeah.
right, okay, because this one I actually really liked. Like first impressions,
Hmm.
just a really fun. Well, that mix of really fun heavy metal, some obviously more flamboyant, ambitious elements, but also a bit like how the Cirith Ungol King of the Dead has some Bark stuff. This one's got some Grieg, obviously with the Hall of the Mountain King.
Yeah.
Um, and but it's also quite bombastic. It pulls on some of this earlier stuff of like barbaric fantasy material, but it is also quite showy and quite a lot of virtuoso moments in there. But more broadly, just going into this band, I haven't listened to any of their other material, but I understand the album before this was a bit of a a stinker in terms of it being like a
Yeah, I
glam
mean
rock album or something. A bit of a Cold
the
Lake.
two, well, Fight for Rock was definitely like a misfire. And even before that, Power of the Night, it's not horrible, but it's definitely not their best. Like a lot of people would say, go over the first album, Sirens, and the EP that was right after it, Dungeons Are Calling, and then just skip right ahead to Call of the Mountain King. Um, and I don't think that's necessarily bad advice.
Yeah, that's the impression I got from this as well. It's just I found it interesting because when a band releases an album that's universally reviled like that, it's often like almost impossible for them to recover, or it takes them many, many years to recover. Celtic Frost being the archetypical example of this, I suppose.
Yeah.
To a lesser extent, Metallica maybe. Whereas these guys, you know, without even missing a beat, just come back with what is, for all intents and purposes, a pretty like high quality heavy metal album by any standards, even outside of just the US power metal thing that we're talking about. Like, I think it's up there in terms of one of the better albums of the '80s.
Yeah, no, I think it does. It this is one of those ones, probably alongside Queensrÿche and a few others, that really kind of hits outside of the US power metal and just kind of, for a lot of people, is just a focus of 80s metal. Um, I think the music video, they were fortunate the music video for Hall of the Mountain King got a fair bit of MTV play. Um, and it was a silly little video, but at the same time, it surprisingly had a decent amount of production for an 80s metal video. Um, and it's interesting where they went from there, because it's crazy for me, because I have a very particular, we discussed this before, like my path into metal. Like I didn't just start with extreme metal. I actually tended to start more with the 80s stuff and then went into European power metal and things like that, because to me I was like, well, what sounds like Maiden? I love Maiden. And it was like, oh, listen to Blind Guardian. And it was like, oh, okay. And one of those very early bands, going from like the Black Sabbaths and the Metallicas, was Savatage. A friend of mine gave me a copy of a much later album, Dead Winter Dead. And from there, I did slowly kind of check out the rest of the discography. So this is a band that has been with me for quite a while, and kind of like Queensryche, they went in a kind of bigger direction. And I mean, if anyone is really familiar with them, the big thing that they ultimately did, kind of spinned off Dead Winter Dead. Some of the members then formed the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, which is where they get their paychecks. And generally, Savatage kind of became the side band once that took off. Um, but yeah, but like they, after Hall of the Mountain King, like a Gutter Ballot started having more kind of concept album themes, and then Streets Rock Opera absolutely did, and then again Dead Winter Dead and Wake 'em Magellan, full on concept albums. So they're definitely a band that headed in the progressive direction, but almost more in a musical way. Like they're definitely Savatage, or the US power metal band that slowly but surely revealed they were theater kid dorks.
That's the impression I was getting from when you were explaining that, and from some of what I was reading about this album is like there's enough straightforward heavy metal in there to please the metal crowd,
Mm-hmm.
but there is clearly a lot of elements that are, well, we mentioned the Grieg thing, but they're bringing in other outside influence as well, outside of heavy metal's usual oeuvre. But yeah, it's interesting to sort of hear that further evolution of the band, where it's almost like they were uh, wanting to evolve out of metal entirely to some extent, and kind of using metal as a sort of convenient tapestry to paint on for a while, and then moving
Yeah,
on.
I mean, I would say Dead Winter Dead is still a metal album. It's just, and even Streets and stuff like that. Um, it's just very much, you see the musical like in the terms of like Broadway musical kind of influences that they meshed. I mean, in some ways, and you can kind of say Hall of the Mountain King is the last album before that really showed its face. Um, like you still have the bombasticness where like here, maybe they were Hall of the Mountain King, not quite that crazy level, but certainly afterward is where that stuff shows up.
Yeah. Interesting. So they're definitely, I could see it as being like they definitely fit within this timeline, no doubt, but they have a sort of legacy and reputation that extends well beyond it. Partly just because of the musical interests of its members. But this next band, how do you pronounce the name? Black Death. Is it Brocas Helm or Brocas Helm?
Oh, uh, yeah, I usually say Brocas Helm.
Brocas Helm. So this one, released the following year, 1988, but in a lot of ways it feels like a throwback to the earlier material. In my notes, I've just put rougher but forgettable brackets, listen again. I did listen again after I wrote those notes, and
Yeah.
I listened to it whilst not doing something else, so my attention wasn't divided, and I was like, what a weird fucking album this is.
Oh yeah. No,
Like it
most
feels like,
people. Yeah.
yeah, it should just be a standard straight up heavy metal album with the usual kind of themes. This time, obviously the Black Death, but there's a bit more of medieval thing going on. But then you listen to it, like, I don't know, the drums keep shuffling around in weird ways. The riffs go off in odd meandering patterns. It feels like they're almost playing prog by mistake. I don't know. Like, I can't
Yeah,
put my finger
it's
on
sort
it.
of like if like a punk slash new wave of British heavy metal band somehow was trying to reverse engineer Yes or something.
Yeah,
Um,
basically.
with while being a three piece.
And that's the thing. You can
Yeah.
listen to it when. So I was listening to it while I was working, and I had the volume
Mhm.
down quite low. And just then it was like, well, this is just sort of a standard heavy metal album because I wasn't concentrating, and it's almost like they smuggled in something like I don't know, beneath the veneer of a heavy metal album, like they're trying to do something quite subversive or subliminal in a way. Because when you do listen to it properly, you're like, hang on, actually, there's something not quite right about this. It's like looking at a picture with all of these minor details slightly distorted and out of focus or something. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think one thing that gets mentioned in Brocas Helm were a big influence, probably even more than Manilla Road and Cirith Ungol on a band that came later, like Slavfig. Like I think Slavfig have even covered a Brocas Helm song or two. I'm more than certain they have. Um, I know Brocas Helm has cited Thin Lizzy as a huge influence. Um, so
Hmm.
I think if you dive into it, you can find that. And mind you, not Thin Lizzy so much as like, the boys are back in town, so much as I think probably stuff like Emerald or even like, I forget the name of it, but that third album where Lizzy was still a bit psychedelic. And I think that's the thing with Brocas Helm is like, weirdly not as old as like Manila Road or Cirith Ungol, but like them, I think put in a lot more 70s influences than other bands did. Another one that comes to mind is Budgie. Uh,
Hmm.
like I definitely feel the Budgie influence with them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's almost by this point it feels subversive, not just for the reasons I mentioned, but going back to like the Manowar galloping rhythm thing.
Hmm.
Um, at the surface, it feels like Brocas are leaning into that, but because they don't play galloping rhythms, or they do, but not only for a few bars or so, and then they sort of go off and do something a little bit more interesting, it feels like they're being subversive when maybe they weren't. They were just sort of drawing on these other influences, and this is the sound that they landed up with. But to my contemporary ear, with all of the kind of history and evolution sort of swirling around my mind, it feels like it's them trying to like commentate on something that had become kind of industry standard by the late 80s, but that probably wasn't their intention at all. It was
Yeah.
just the style that they landed with. But yeah, um,
I mean, I think, sometimes when you talk about like metal bands and you talk about like this band being progressive or this band like really focusing on the harmonic. And sometimes you just have to say, look at a band where you're like, yeah, there's some progressive elements, but it's best just to call them weird.
Yeah.
And for all the bands in this scene, and I've kind of mentioned like Cirith, Ungol, and Manilla Road have a bit weirder tendencies. If you want the weirdest band out of this bunch, Brocas Helm's the one to go with.
Oh, I definitely agree with that, and I definitely agree with the distinction. Um, I'd include something like avant-garde in there as well, in terms of avant-garde feels very intentional in the same way that progressive feels very intentional. It's a premeditated artistic project,
Mm-hmm.
whereas for a lot of these bands, and this is true of a lot of early metal as well, it's a combination of absorbing their influences, trying to do something new with it, coming up against limitations in budget or their own abilities, or it just coming out that way. Let's not forget that these bands, they when they were writing this material and recording it, they'd listened to far less metal than we have because just less of it existed and less of it was available
Yep.
to them. So they had, in that sense, a lot more freedom to do some of this stuff, but they weren't progressive in the sense that, like a lot of the classic 70s progressive bands were like music students. They'd studied music and they had a very kind of clear idea of, they were still very experimental, but they had a very clear idea of how to get weird sounds out of their instruments, whereas these guys, might have landed on it accidentally. There's no, Cirith Ungol are a weird band, but I don't think they ever intended to sound weird. It's just the signature that they landed on, and I get a similar vibe from the Brocas Helm as well. And that's kind of why I keep saying it. Yeah, on paper it just feels like a straight up heavy metal album, but then yeah, when you pick it apart, it just it's all wrong, but in the right way.
Well,
Um,
and I mentioned, their first album came out in '84, and they didn't really have too much before. Like, I think the band formed in '82, but I did a quick look to remind myself, and actually, one of the main guys, James Schumacher, the bassist, he is 70, so I would not be surprised about the '70s influence.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, and then almost at the opposite end of the spectrum, we're on to Liege Lord, Master
Mhm.
Control. Um, I think I have the least to say about this one, in that it is kind of exemplary of the trend of the style being much more polished. It's also probably the first of this bunch that is recognizably modern power metal, or our modern understanding of power metal, in that it's much more polished. It kind of, in that sense, I guess it feels more European. The musicianship is tighter, it's more direct. It's not progressive, but it is technical. The vocalist, probably not an original observation, but Dickinson clone, basically, not in a bad way necessarily. But there is also definitely, to a lot of the riffs, thrash influence there,
Yeah.
in the same way as you'd get thrash in something like Blind Guardian by this point. And yeah, as I said, that bleeds into the power metal thing because there's a lot of thrash riffs in power metal, modern power metal anyway.
I think, again, for anyone coming into this not aware of the band, this is their third and pretty much last album. Yeah, it's their last album. And this is very much the like, it's not like the earlier two are dramatically different, but this is definitely by '88 them wanting to compete with what they had been seeing happening with speed metal and thrash metal. Like, and they were not the only band at that time. Like at this point, '87 to '89, a lot of these bands either were going full prog, like as we've talked about with what happened later with some of these bands, or we're going full thrash. Even someone like Manilla Road, like I didn't recommend it, but like in itself might be interesting for you to check out what's considered their thrash albums, like Mystification and Out of the Abyss, because they really do go into that, just sort of take what was their sound and fully implement thrash into it. And Liege Lord here, I recommended this album because I think it's the best of everything they did, like just in terms of the songs themselves. Um, it's I know you felt like it didn't stand out too much, and that's fair, but I do think it works really well, and it's a good album that represents what a lot of these bands were looking at and trying to do by '88.
I think I think the reason it didn't stand out so much is because it's probably closer to stuff that I'm more familiar with by this point.
Yeah.
Whereas the earlier stuff, um, it sounds like, it's obviously a familiar style to me to some extent, but they all have their own eccentricities in a lot of ways. Whereas
Yeah.
this feels like a much tighter, more polished presentation. And that's not to say it's bad. It's a fantastic album, but um, it was not alien to me in the same way as coming off something like the Brocas Helm. Um,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
and yeah, I could definitely see the kind of, what's the word? Um, yeah, I think that was it actually. Just yeah, the fact that they're trying to compete with thrash in a lot of ways. I guess you could say something similar about Judas Priest's Painkiller in terms of them trying to amp up their sound and realizing that they'd been kind of falling behind. Um, yeah, and I think moving on to the Helstar Nosferatu, I was actually familiar with this album. I realized going
Mhm.
back to it, I have listened to this one before. Um, and I think is this their third or fourth album?
Fourth, I think.
Fourth, because I haven't listened to any of their others, but I do really like this album in a way that I wasn't so taken with the Liege Lord, just because it is every bit as sort of clean and polished, and it's like the coming of age of US power metal, for want of a better word. But it has a bit more flamboyance to it. There's definitely a neoclassical
Hmm.
element to a lot of the guitar leads as well. It just felt a bit more dynamic, whereas the Liege Lord is more just down the barrel quality polished heavy metal. But to be fair, I probably do need to listen to the Liege Lord a couple more times. Whereas with Helstar, it's like, yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with the album. Listening to it again was, yeah, just reconfirmed what I already thought in terms of it being, I wouldn't say an outlier, but it balances well the flamboyance and character of well, their own style, but also like American heavy metal, but it also bridges into the European style, but it competes with late 80s thrash in terms of it being uh, it still sounds quite fresh, it sounds quite modern. It doesn't sound as dated as some of these other works, and it sounds quite intentional, like they're in control of the mix, and they're in control, definitely in control of their instruments and how they're presenting themselves. Whereas, yeah, some of the earlier material is kind of, yeah, almost sort of happening by accident at times. But yeah, great album.
Yeah. Their first album, Burning Star, I enjoy that album quite a bit as well, but it's definitely rougher and at that point definitely not necessarily trying to compete with like the thrash and speed that is really kind of taken over by the late '80s. And here they do that, but at the same time, I mean, Hellstar and the word flamboyant kind of go hand in hand. Especially if you see any videos of them, and even to this day, like James Rivera is a very interesting character. One who, not unlike many a band, apparently some people have a hard time working with him. But I've met him in person and talked with him, and he's yeah. You don't quite know how much he's putting on airs, but he pretty much acts like he is a vampire. Um, and yeah, you really kind of walk away kind of wondering how much of this is an act and how much isn't it, and you really don't know. Um, I mean, clear. I think I've seen you see. I mean, you see him perform in the sunlight, so clearly that's not part of whatever lore he accepts. But and this album, obviously, it's called Nosferatu, although it's not referencing the movie so much as Dracula, and actually has samples throughout it from I think one of the '70s or '80s versions of it, the one that had God, I'm forgetting the name of the actor, but yeah, it's like half of the album is essentially doing that, and then the other half are just different songs about different other subjects. It is probably their best. Like I think in terms of the musicianship, the songwriting, and like you said, given that it had a pretty good production with it, it actually does have a bit of a timeless quality to it.
Mm. Yeah, having floated around the goth scene for quite a few years, I've met plenty of people that seem to think they're vampires. So, yeah, it's not unfamiliar as a disposition. Um, yeah, so we touched on the fact that the 90s were a crazy decade in a lot of ways, in more ways than one for metal. Um,
Yeah.
didn't all but kill heavy metal. It did survive. We mentioned Blind Guardian, who, for all intents and purposes, was a 90s band. Power metal in its sort of modern iteration really got going by that point. Um, but touching on the dated aspect to it, um, I came across an interesting discussion on Metal Archives around the sort of fact that heavy metal, traditional heavy metal in this guise, not just US power metal, but the Euro style that we were talking about and the new over British heavy metal, is just a bit more niche than it used to be, and probably more niche than extreme metal, certainly more niche than the more popular genres like deathcore and metalcore and so on.
Yeah.
Outside of a few bands that transcend their genre, Priest and Iron Maiden being the ones that people keep mentioning in the same breath, even though they are quite different beasts in more ways than one, not just sound wise, but also the audience and popularity that they attract. But also modern, not to say younger bands, because some of them are quite old by this point, but bands that formed after 2000, say, struggling to kind of gain a niche in the same way as other kind of bigger bands this side of the century have. Maybe something like Mastodon, Gojira, that kind of thing. There's sort of commercially successful metal bands, Ghost being the obvious one as well, who aren't sort of completely separate from this style. They do obviously draw on a lot of like classic heavy metal, but it seems to be more 70s. I mean, I don't listen to Ghost that much because I don't want to subject myself to it, but
I mean, I'm fine outing myself as a big Ghost fan, but
yeah, fair enough.
I mean,
they're Ghost fans, but they're a good example here because I know plenty of people that don't listen to heavy metal at all, but do listen to bands like Ghost, or they do find themselves like I've got friends that don't listen to heavy metal but love Blood Incantation, for example, who are far more extreme, but because they have this eclectic style that draws on a lot of different things, people find something appealing about it, even though they wouldn't touch an Immolation album or whatever.
Or even like Mithras.
Well, yeah, them too as well. But in terms of like heavy metal, there was a lot of different like ideas being thrown around on the thread, but for me, it's always come back to this thing that it sounds dated, even if you're playing it sort of today with relatively modern production and so on, in a similar way that I sometimes think of thrash as being a bit dated. But I'm wondering if that is because I got into extreme metal first, essentially, and I think extreme metal fans have a tendency to view things as sort of an inevitable evolution. Is like heavy metal leads to thrash metal, leads to early black metal, leads to early death metal, and so on. And these bands, and once you get that next level of extremity, the older one almost becomes obsolete. Once you get death metal, thrash becomes obsolete. So of course it sounds dated. In the same way as like once you get thrash metal, heavy metal becomes obsolete, which is kind of why I've ignored a good chunk of 80s metal, because I think we'll by around 82, 83, there's no point listening to it anymore because the bands
Just
that
thrash and
the next
black and
chapters
death.
got going. But also, I just wanted to get your take on it in terms of like, does it still sound dated? And do you think that might be the reason why it struggles to kind of gain a more like popular foothold? I mean, we are talking more in terms of commercial success. It's obviously still quite a popular style because there's a lot of bands around and it does have a fan base. But it seems to be more linked to festivals rather than bands being able to tour in the same way that a Blood Incantation can still fill out venues on a national tour or something.
I think, I mean, there's many different ways to go on this, and I think hopefully we'll have other opportunities to dive into it again. But I think what strikes me right now in thinking about like why doesn't like a resurgence of this sound get as big as what it was in the 80s. um I think we've had a number of waves of nostalgia, and with that there is some genuine innovation or at least rediscovery of certain things for a generation where it seems novel. um like we talked about like how many of the 80s bands just got wiped out with the aesthetic changes that happened in the 90s. But the one thing you can say that got brought back in the 90s was a love for the 70s, late 60s and 70s. Like, again, Soundgarden pulling from, Led Zeppelin. Black Sabbath, I think, suddenly getting popular in a way that kind of got poo-pooed in the 80s, especially the Aussie era. Grunge was something that the slowing down, the moodiness, uh, allowed for a lot of 70s sounds to become appealing. And it's no surprise, I think you look at the 90s as a golden age of doom metal. Like doom didn't really fit in with like the cocaine fueled 80s so much, and you kind of stuck out like a sore thumb during that. But in the 90s, when it was pot or heroin in some circles, uh doom metal fit very well with grunge. And so it's not surprising you get something like Cathedral being successful. They were the Peaceful Three and everything else. Um, and even Cathedral getting very much more in the 70s. So I think you had that, and that continued even onward into the 2000s with stuff like Electric Wizard and stuff. But then you had the wave of nostalgia for thrash came about, I think, because of the metalcore. Like you had bands like, and I know some people don't call them metalcore, but you have bands like Shadows Fall and bands like Lamb of God suddenly hyping like Megadeth. Oh, like Peace Sells is the greatest album ever. And then you had this generation of like going, oh, I need to check that out. Like thrash, I think, really came back in the early 2000s thanks to metalcore or these type of bands, the thrashier metalcore bands making reference. And then I think people then were like, okay, what's the next thing to look back to? And in the late 2000s into the 2010s, you had traditional metal, which, is an umbrella term, included new wave British heavy metal, but also things like US power metal. And the problem is at that point, unlike the earlier waves of nostalgia, we started seeing the collapse of the traditional music industry. And I think part of the reason that trad metal as a revival, even though I think there are some really standout bands in it, um, didn't get anywhere as successful is because metal and rock music in general had started falling the wayside because of these very big scale changes where
Mm.
um, stuff on purely an internet level, on the domination of the DJ, the domination of the digital musician, of the electronic music, of hip hop. uh I mean, you can even see this, just, I mean, good lord, you look at, like, it's funny, like you go on social media and you'll see people talking about Coachella right now. Like as we're talking about this, like I was just on Threads earlier and seeing people talking about this or that. And I haven't cared about Coachella since the late 2000s when they had actual rock bands really playing. And since the late 2000s, like it's been like a novelty. Oh, they might have some legacy acts. Maybe Iggy and the Stooges will play amongst a bunch of Dojo Cat and pop artists and Beyonce headlining or something like that. So I think, unfortunately, when it got to the time where there was an energy and a cultural impetus to go back into the 80s to check out the traditional metal, when people were getting a little tired of the thrash nostalgia, that just coincided with the real start of the collapse of the traditional rock music industry.
I think it's the vocals. Um, no,
I mean, well,
I'm joking,
yeah,
but I
yeah,
do actually want to build on your point a little bit because
yeah,
at the same time as the trad revival you're talking about was happening, there was a an old school death metal revival going on,
true.
which I mean, you could argue that Blood Incantation, are the ultimate like result of that, but they're the exception that proves the rule in a
Kind
lot of
of,
ways. In the same way that
yeah,
Ghost, most people that like Ghost don't really like heavy metal, so on and so forth. But with death metal, I guess as well as the industry collapsing and all of the stuff you just referenced there was also at the fan level much more of an atomization going on. So you have a proliferation of bands, which means that there are fewer fans to go around for each band. So no one's kind of coalescing around a handful of bands to bring them popularity. It's either much more like regional or it's kind of just what you happen to stumble upon online to some extent. And for death metal, it's kind of been used to that. It had a brief flirtation with mainstream success in the 90s, but it's used to being an underground genre. And I think most of the bands doing revival death metal never really expected to get particularly big. And I'm not
no,
saying that like traditional revival heavy metal bands expected that either, but you would kind of think, well, it is a more commercial sound. It does reference stuff that was massive at one point in the 80s. You'd think it would maybe attract a bit more of an audience. But I think the fact that fans are so much more segregated, um, but also specific to metal, this goes back to this co-evolution thing. It does almost feel like two entirely distinct forms of music now that just happen to be have sort of share an ancestry, but also share a name in terms of metal. In that, um, I know plenty of extreme metal fans who would rather listen to like hard house than anything approaching traditional heavy metal these days. Like they
mm,
just see it as a completely unrelated form of music that just has some distant ancestry that is kind of like a memory. Um, and that kind of speaks to the fact that you can just sort of completely avoid it in today's world because there's so much other music and it's so kind of atomized to some extent. And for me, I was always like, well, I've always had a soft spot for a lot of these bands, and it's always been more than just historical interest in terms of me wanting to go back to the origins of some of the extreme metal I like. But it's also in doing this, even in going back to these older bands, and then like reading about some of the newer bands that are pulling on a lot of this legacy. It does feel like, to quote the kids, I've slept on it a little bit in terms of just it being
yeah.
this whole other world that's like I've just not bothered to explore because it feels like like an entirely distinct genre, which I don't think would have been
Well,
possible with like
yeah.
the traditional music press. If I was reading a magazine that did feature death metal bands next to trad heavy metal bands and so on, I would maybe be more into it. Like,
I mean, it's interesting because in some ways this is where Ghost came out of. Just that Ghost was also kind of pulling a lot of 70s influences, which kind of made them a little bit different than others. Um, like I was going to comment, and this is a good time I think to mention it, that like for me, there were certain bands where whether it was Fate's Warning from that movie or Savatage just being really early on that like these US power metal bands were exposed to me. But generally a lot of this stuff happened to me in the 2010s, or at least really late 2000s into the 2010s. And a lot of that I have to chalk up to, maybe at a certain point, like getting a little bored with black or death metal, like feeling like I'd kind of absorbed as much as I can, and maybe finding, I think for people who were a little sick and tired of like the domination of brutal death and the domination of technical death, like something like, oh, here's a band that sounds like Entombed, it felt like fresh air. Um, and certainly as someone who really never cared for the really tech brutal stuff and still doesn't, that I think was true for me. Um, but then when you get people like, and I know this was a huge influence on me, Fenrez name dropping all of these bands, doing his own little radio show and mentioning all this stuff. I mean, the fact that like I was going to pull it up because I wanted to make sure I cited the exact bit, but on the Dark Throne album, Fuck Off and Die, which was what, 2007, I believe, literally mentions, along with Venom's Acid Queen, mentions Manila Road. I sold my soul to Manila Road, modern metal, I don't give a fuck. Um,
Okay.
I think that was the first time I ever heard about Manila Road. Like I had never heard about them before that. Mind you, at that point, 2007, I'd been in the metal for about 7 years. So I'm not that shocked. Again, at that point, even in the internet, I don't, you'd, you'd have to really try to find people just didn't talk about, that band. Um, so I think with Fenrez, and then him championing a lot of, and he still does it to this day, a lot of newer bands that pull older sounds from the 80s. Like, I mean, In Solitude being one of my all-time favorites. And, unfortunately they broke up early, but they were a band clearly not wanting to stay in that, as their last album, Sister, definitely showed sort of a bit of an evolution. But then things like Ghosts, like I remember like before when like the first single came out, before even the first album, you had Fenrez and you had people like Eric from Watain really hyping it up as like, oh, this is a cool, interesting band, because they were friends with Tobias from Repugnant and they knew who he was. So they were like, oh, yeah, yeah. I love your cool little retro 70s into 80s band. Like if Merciful Fate leaned more into Scorpions and Rainbow, like, yeah, sure, I'll hype this up. And then
Yeah.
no one knew it, but that would take the fuck off.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're gonna have to wrap up shortly, but
Yeah.
this probably does warrant its own separate episode to some extent. But going back to like my experiences of getting into metal, it's a good example of where I keep saying like a lot of people that like a band like Ghost don't really like any other metal bands, but that was true of the vast majority of new metal. But you also had
Mhm.
a generation of like essentially millennials discovering metal through that, and then
Yep.
some newer bands are starting to call back to some of those riffs and so on. And we will complain about it because it's just a watered down version of
What
various
came before?
yeah, what came before, and more underground stuff, more interesting stuff. But there will always be a handful of that generation that goes back and rediscovers this stuff again through that material. And yeah, they're either sort of, well, there's obviously so much more material for them to go out and discover now in terms of reading interviews from these bands about who influenced them, or just going on online discussions and seeing what people are saying. But also, yeah, that was
Mhm.
true of new metal, and I think the popularity boom of metal in general was a result of that. But like you've already said, it kind of just happened to coincide with the collapse of the traditional music industry, alongside the fact that you can sort of do your fandom from home now on Bandcamp and so on, which has
Yeah.
kind of just led to this sort of siloed kind of attitude to a lot of it. So you can have entire scenes and entire like worlds within metal that you can potentially remain completely ignorant to, because you just didn't follow the right link or the right connection and so on. Um, but yeah,
No, and I
it's
think
gone.
it's a deeper thing to get into, but just I think the one thing, where I think like things like hip hop and pop have dominated so much is that the economics of the industry have changed, the technology has changed, and what it's done has made album listening less in vogue or less accessible than the single. Like I think for the last 10, potentially 15 years, the single has dominated in a way that like pre-Beatles Sergeant Pepper would be the comparison.
Yes, that's very true. And also something else that just occurred to me is bands, pop and hip hop and other kind of, more mainstream, but maybe, stuff that's kind of does have an experimental edge to it. It lends itself to the solo artist, and it kind of favors the solo artist as well.
Mhm.
Especially if you're talking about the commercial side, whereas you could easily do that with black metal. I know some more experimental, like avant-garde metal bands tend to sort of run solo and maybe get a band together for live stuff. But heavy metal, traditional heavy metal in all its forms, is very much a band thing.
Yep.
You need at least three musicians to play off each other, and it sort of links to traditional heavy rock in that sense. And it's just much more expensive and inconvenient now, especially if you're not in an area where you have many like-minded individuals. And that's, it's not a point unique to heavy metal, but it definitely has an effect, I think. Cool. I think we'll wrap things up there then.
Yeah, before we navel gaze into the abyss too much.
Yeah, this will probably be a sequel at some point where maybe we'll wrap this up into a state of metal mid-year review in June or something. But for now, thanks very much for putting together this list and also for discussing it in such detail. It's definitely not going to be the end of it for me. There'll probably be some really annoying blog posts coming up soon about this on the Hate Meditations blog. But for now, yeah, thanks very much, Joseph. It's been a pleasure as always.
Yeah, always.
And thank you very much for listening. If you're still there, if you're new to some of this, as new as I am, then yeah, please do check out some of these albums. I hope we've kind of managed to sort of tempt you into listening to some of this. I know I'm going to go away and explore more of it. And if you're already a fan of it, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion and you haven't been screaming too loud at my ignorance to some of this. But yeah, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.